The chamber was silent. Not the comfortable silence of consensus, but the cold, suffocating silence of creatures who had just heard something that terrified them to their very cores. Ambassador Vrethkai of the Silhari Collective was the first to speak, his 4 vocal membranes trembling as he addressed the 700 delegates seated around the Grand Council ring of Arcturus Prime. The ring itself, a marvel of engineering that orbited a dying star 60 light-years from the nearest human colony, was considered neutral ground. It had been neutral for 3,000 years. Today that neutrality felt like a cage. The motion before us, Vrethkai said carefully, his translator device working overtime to soften the edges of his words, is whether to formally request that the Terran Confederation refrain from entering the Calyx conflict. A murmur rolled through the chamber like a tide. 700 species, 700 civilizations that had taken millions of years of evolution to produce, and every single one of them felt it. That crawling, primal sensation that something had fundamentally shifted in the universe. The humans were watching. "I would like to remind the Council," said Elder Sul of the Yethran Communion, rising slowly from her crystalline chair, her bioluminescent skin cycling through nervous shades of amber and red, "that Earth has not been invited into this conflict. The Calyx War is between the Drenethi Empire and the Collective of Free Worlds. It does not concern the Terrans." "Everything concerns the Terrans now," whispered a delegate from the back rows. Nobody could tell who said it. Nobody needed to. The Calyx conflict had begun 7 standard years ago as a border dispute. A small moon, rich in gravitational ore, sat equidistant between Drenethi space and the outer rings claimed by the Collective of Free Worlds. It had been a minor thing. The kind of minor thing that 2 civilizations with moderate military capacity could argue over for decades without either side winning. Then the Drenethi had done something stupid. They had attacked a Terran-registered cargo freighter called the Allgate Bridge. The freighter had been delivering medical supplies to a neutral station near the conflict zone, 6 humans aboard. The attack had been a mistake. The Drenethi commander had misidentified the vessel's registry in the chaos of battle. He had corrected his error within minutes and transmitted formal apologies within hours. The humans had acknowledged the apology. They had recovered their dead. They had said nothing further. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, the Galactic Council had received 47 intelligence reports from varying sources, all pointing to the same conclusion: the Terran Confederation was mobilizing. Not loudly. Not with declarations of war or furious broadcasts across the Ensemble network. Quietly. The way a mountain doesn't announce the avalanche. "The Drenethi Empire," said Ambassador Vrethkai, "has officially requested that this council mediate a ceasefire with the Collective of Free Worlds. They are willing to concede the moon in question, provide reparations for the past 7 years of conflict, and recognize a 40 light-year buffer zone around collective territory." Another wave of murmurs. The Drenethi had been winning the war. 3 weeks ago they had been winning. What changed their position so dramatically? Asked a young Polhari delegate, new to the council and clearly confused. Elder Sul looked at him with something that might have been pity. "The Allgate Bridge," she said simply. The young delegate blinked his 4 eyes. "But the humans accepted the apology." "They accepted it," Vrethkai interrupted softly. "They did not forget it." There was a difference. The entire galaxy was only now beginning to understand that difference. "We have received a communication from the Terran Confederation's Foreign Relations Division," said Council Speaker Marith, a towering insectoid from the Plex systems. She tapped her forelimb against the speaker's podium and brought up a holographic display. It is brief. It reads: "The Terran Confederation notes with interest the ongoing Calyx conflict and sends its condolences to all parties who have suffered losses. We encourage a peaceful resolution. We are available to assist with humanitarian relief efforts at any time." Silence. Pure, electric, terrified silence. "They said nothing threatening," the young Polhari delegate said, confused. "They offered help." "Yes," said Elder Sul. "That is what makes it terrifying." She turned to address the full council, her bioluminescence shifting to the deep blue that her species associated with grave seriousness. "In all the centuries that humanity has been a spacefaring civilization, we have watched them carefully. We have studied their wars, their own internal wars back on their homeworld before they reached the stars. We have analyzed their military doctrine, their psychology, their history. Do you know what we found?" Nobody spoke. "We found that when humans are merely annoyed, they file complaints. When they are angry, they make demands. When they are outraged, they make speeches and mobilize protests." She paused. "But when they go quiet, when they stop talking altogether, when they simply begin to move, that is when civilizations end." The young delegate looked around the chamber and saw for the first time that he was not surrounded by politicians managing a border dispute. He was surrounded by survivors, all of whom had read the same histories, all of whom understood what the soft, polite message from the Terran Foreign Relations Division actually meant in the language humans used when they were done talking. It meant, "We are coming. Prepare accordingly. We must send the plea," Vrethkai said. "We must ask the Terrans to stand down, or at minimum to communicate their intentions. The Drenethi are ready to end this war. The collective will accept the ceasefire. All we need is for the humans to step back." "And if they don't step back?" someone asked. The chamber fell silent again. Nobody had an answer. Because everyone in that room, every ancient, wise, vastly experienced species in that grand rotating council ring, had studied enough history to know that when humanity decided something was worth fighting for, the question was never whether they would win. The question was only how much of the galaxy would look different when they were finished. The motion was passed unanimously. The desperate plea was transmitted to Earth. And somewhere in the dark between stars, 14 Terran Confederation warships continued their quiet, steady journey toward the Calyx system. Not fast enough to be a declaration, not slow enough to be ignored. Perfectly, precisely, terrifyingly in between. Fleet Admiral Yara Osei had a ritual she performed every morning aboard the TCS Unbroken Will. She made coffee, real coffee, from beans grown in a greenhouse module attached to the ship's starboard hull. She stood at the viewport of her private quarters, watching the stars streak past in the long blue smear of near-lightspeed transit. And she read the names. There were 6 of them, printed on a single piece of actual paper, another rarity carried deliberately, and she read them every single morning. Chief Engineer Daria Molina. Navigation Officer James Sutherland. Cargo Specialist Priya Raghunathan. Medical Officer Tobias Vance. Deckhand Rosa Ferreira. Deckhand Chukwemeka Adeyemi. Crew of the Allgate Bridge. Osei had known 2 of them personally. Jim Sutherland had served under her when she commanded the TCS Resilience, 10 years ago. He'd been young then, nervous, terrible at poker but brilliant with star charts. She'd written his letter of recommendation when he applied for cargo fleet work. He'd wanted something quieter, he'd told her. More peaceful. He had a daughter now, had a daughter. The girl was 11 years old and had watched a news broadcast 3 weeks ago that told her she would never see her father again. The Admiral folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into her breast pocket. Behind her, the door chimed. "Admiral. Signal from the Council of Arcturus Prime. Priority diplomatic channel." "On screen," she said without turning. The message was long. Eloquent. Desperate. 700 civilizations, speaking with one voice, begging the Terran Confederation to stand down. The Drenethi were willing to make peace. The war was ending. 6 humans had died in a regrettable accident, and the perpetrators had apologized, and surely, that was enough. Osei read it twice. She thought about Chukwemeka Adeyemi, who had survived 3 pirate attacks and a catastrophic hull breach on his first posting, who had celebrated his 40th birthday 6 weeks ago with a video call to his mother in Lagos, who had joked in his last message home that he was getting too old for deep space work and was thinking about retiring to run a fishing charter on Lake Victoria. She thought about Rosa Ferreira, who had been on her first ever long-haul cargo run, 22 years old, who had sent her Academy friends a holographic selfie from the observation deck of the Allgate Bridge with the caption, "Guess I'm a space trucker now lol." She thought about what the Galactic Council's message kept delicately not saying, that the Drenethi Empire had attacked a clearly marked civilian humanitarian vessel, killed 6 non-combatants, and expected that an apology would make the mathematics balance out. Osei turned to her communications officer. "Draft a response to the Galactic Council. Acknowledge receipt of their plea. Tell them we appreciate the Council's commitment to peace. Tell them the Terran Confederation remains committed to all treaties and obligations under the Arcturus Accords." She paused. "And tell them we'll be in the Calyx system in 11 days. The communications officer hesitated. "Admiral, should I include any assurances about our intentions?" "Our intentions," Osei said carefully, "are to ensure that the ceasefire holds, that humanitarian corridors are established and protected, and that the circumstances surrounding the destruction of the Allgate Bridge are fully and transparently investigated. And if the Drenethi object to our presence?" Osei finally turned from the viewport. She was not a large woman, average height, slight build, the kind of person you might overlook in a crowd. But there was something in her eyes when she spoke about the Allgate Bridge that her crew had learned to recognize. Not rage. Not grief. Something colder. Something patient. Then they can explain to us in detail exactly why a Drenithy battle cruiser fired 3 anti-ship missiles at a vessel that was broadcasting a humanitarian registry signal on all standard frequencies, and why it took 47 minutes to transmit the apology when the error was supposedly identified within minutes. The communications officer said nothing. The math, the admiral said softly, doesn't add up. And the Drenithy know that we know the math doesn't add up. Which is why they're willing to give away a moon and a buffer zone to a war they were winning 3 weeks ago. She turned back to the stars. Draft the message. Don't add any assurances we haven't decided to give. Throughout the ship, 1,400 Terran crew members went about their duties with the calm efficiency that the Confederation Navy was known for. They ran diagnostics. They held training exercises. They ate in the mess hall and played cards and argued about sports leagues back home. They were, in every observable way, not preparing for a war. But their weapons were calibrated. Their shields were cycling at peak efficiency. Their targeting systems had been quietly updated with every known specification of Drenithy military hardware. Not because Admiral Osei intended to start a war, but because she was a student of history. And history had taught her that the only thing more dangerous than an enemy who thought you were coming to fight was an enemy who thought you were too peaceful to defend yourself. 11 days. In the Calyx system, the Drenithy Empire's War Council was having very long, very quiet conversations. In the collective of Free World's Parliament, representatives were voting on the ceasefire with unprecedented speed. In the Galactic Council chambers at Arcturus Prime, 700 delegates were waiting for Earth's reply with the particular quality of tension usually reserved for natural disasters. And on the TCS Unbroken Will, Admiral Yara Osei made herself another cup of coffee, took the paper from her breast pocket, and read 6 names out loud. Not as a prayer. As a promise. High War Marshal Dravak stood before a holographic display of the Calyx system and tried very hard not to show his generals that he was afraid. The Drenithy were an old species. 6,000 years of continuous spacefaring civilization. 3 major wars against peer-level threats, all won. An empire that stretched across 42 star systems. Their military doctrine was built on the philosophy of measured aggression. Strike first, strike hard, negotiate from strength. They were not, as a people, accustomed to fear. But every Drenithy military officer above the rank of sector commander was required to pass a course called Historical Conflict Analysis, non-Drenithy engagements. It was a 2-year curriculum. Dravak had graduated first in his class 30 years ago. He remembered every lesson, particularly the human ones. The fleet analysis, he said. General Karath activated the display. 14 vessels. He listed their classifications with the flat, careful voice of someone trying to make a list of dangerous things sound routine. 2 heavy cruisers for destroyers, 6 frigates, 2 support vessels. 14 ships. The Drenithy Empire could field 600 vessels in this sector within 3 weeks. On paper, Karath said, it is not a significant force. On paper, Dravak agreed. There was a particular lesson in historical conflict analysis that every student remembered, not because it was the longest chapter but because it was the shortest. 2 pages at the end of the human section. It was titled, The Principle of the Burning Bridge. The lesson described a pattern in human military history that analysts had initially dismissed as emotional irrationality. In conflict after conflict, both ancient and modern, human forces that had been pushed past a certain threshold, that had absorbed losses that rational strategic analysis suggested should cause retreat or surrender, instead did the opposite. They stopped retreating. They stopped calculating odds. They fought with a totality that bore no relationship to expected survival models. The Drenithy analyst who first studied this pattern had called it suicidal. Later analysts with more data had corrected the terminology. It was not suicidal because humans who fought this way tended to win at rates that defied statistical probability. The correct term, eventually agreed upon, was transcendently motivated. Meaning, they had found something worth losing everything for. The Allgate Bridge, Dravak said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. Came out anyway. His generals looked at him. Commander Vreth made a mistake, Karath said carefully. He misidentified. He fired 3 missiles, Dravak said, into a vessel broadcasting a humanitarian signal on all standard frequencies. At a range close enough that our optical systems should have been able to read the ship's designation on the hull. He turned to look at Karath. How long ago was this conflict doctrine written? The one that says civilian vessels in a combat zone are acceptable losses if there's any ambiguity about their registry. Karath had no answer. Dravak turned back to the display. 14 ships. Moving at a careful, deliberate speed. Not racing. Not broadcasting demands. Just coming. He thought about what he knew of human history, the sieges that lasted years, the retreats that were secretly tactical repositionings, the peace treaties that turned out to be breathing room. He thought about a particular set of statistics from the historical files. Humans were the only known species that had ever, on multiple occasions, won a war while being significantly outnumbered by conventional military metrics. Not because their technology was superior though it was good. Not because their tactics were particularly innovative though they were adaptive. But because of something that no other species had ever quite been able to quantify or replicate. They remembered. Every other species processed loss as data. You counted casualties, assessed strategic impact, adjusted your models, moved on. This was rational. This was efficient. Humans processed loss differently. They counted casualties too. They assessed strategic impact. They adjusted their models. And then, this was the part that the Drenithy analysts had never quite understood even after centuries of study, they attached the numbers to names. And the names to faces. And the faces to people who had mothers and daughters and colleagues who missed them and 11-year-old children who waited for video calls that would never come. And then they moved toward the source of that loss with the patience of geological processes and the precision of mathematical proofs. "We are giving away the moon," said General Karath. "We are giving away the moon," Dravak confirmed. "And the buffer zone. And the buffer zone. And the reparations. And the reparations." Dravak clasped his hands behind his back. "And Commander Vreth is being remanded to a full war crimes tribunal, with complete transparency and Terran observer access to all proceedings." There was a silence in the War Council chamber. "That last part was not part of the original ceasefire terms," Karath said carefully. "No," said Dravak. "I added it this morning." He looked at his general. "We fired 3 missiles into a humanitarian vessel, Karath. We killed 6 civilians. And we thought an apology would be sufficient because we calculated that the Terran Confederation would weigh the cost of war against the cost of 6 lives and choose peace." He paused. "We forgot to calculate correctly." "The cost of 6 lives," Karath said slowly. "To them," Dravak said, "there is no cost too high. That is what we forgot. That is what every species forgets, eventually until they're reminded." He turned back to the display. 14 ships. Moving steadily. Transmit the full tribunal offer to the Galactic Council. Make sure the Terrans receive a direct copy before the Council does. As a gesture of good faith? As proof, Dravak said, that we understand what we did. Because they need to know that we know. That is the only thing that has ever worked with humans. He looked at those 14 ships one more time. Not apologies. Understanding. The message was transmitted within the hour. The Calyx system's outer boundary was a beautiful place, objectively speaking. A scattered disk of ancient ice and rock surrounding a golden dwarf star. The debris field caught the light at a particular angle in the early planetary morning that turned everything a deep, cathedral amber. Navigation Officer Chen had mentioned it twice since they dropped out of transit speed. Admiral Osei had barely noticed. She was reading the Drenithy message. The full text, with its legal appendices and its proposed tribunal structure and its list of evidence that the Empire was prepared to surrender to independent investigators. "They're giving us Commander Vreth," said her first officer, Commander Takahashi Ryo. He was standing at parade rest to her left, and she could hear the particular controlled flatness in his voice that told her he was managing strong feelings. Full jurisdiction. Complete records from the Allgate engagement. "I see that," she said. "They didn't have to do that." Pause. "The ceasefire terms didn't require it." "No," she said. "They offered it anyway." She looked up from the display and out through the bridge viewport at the amberlit debris field. She had carried 6 names in her breast pocket for 3 weeks. She had read them every morning as her fleet moved through the dark, and she had let the weight of them, not fuel her anger exactly but focus it. Sharpen it into something precise and deliberate. Something that would accomplish what anger alone never could. "What's the status of the ceasefire negotiations?" she asked. "Formally signed 4 hours ago," said Communications Officer Huang. "The Drenithy have begun withdrawing from contested territory. The Collective of Free Worlds has suspended offensive operations. Galactic Council observers are en route." Pause. "They're calling it the Calyx Accord." 6 civilians, someone said quietly on the bridge. Osei didn't turn to see who. It didn't matter. The sentiment was shared. 6 civilians, she agreed. And their deaths will not become nothing. That's why we came. She had thought a great deal over the past 3 weeks about the difference between justice and vengeance. They could look identical from a distance. Both involved making someone pay for harm done. But they operated on fundamentally different principles. Vengeance was satisfying a feeling. Justice was enforcing a standard. Vengeance said, "You hurt us, so we hurt you back." Justice said, "This action was wrong and there must be consequences, and those consequences must be applied consistently, so that the next commander in the next conflict zone hesitates before firing missiles at a ship full of doctors." Vengeance ended with rubble. Justice ended with a precedent. "The Galactic Council is requesting a formal statement from our fleet," said Huang. "They want to know whether we'll accept the Drenethi offer and hold position outside the Calyx system." Osei stood up. "Broadcast on all diplomatic frequencies, including directly to the Drenethi War Council." She clasped her hands behind her back, a gesture she was not entirely aware she had picked up from the historical files on ancient naval commanders. "This is Admiral Yara Osei of the Terran Confederation Fleet, commanding Task Force Allgate. The Terran Confederation acknowledges the ceasefire agreement and commends all parties for their commitment to a peaceful resolution of the Calyx conflict. We acknowledge the Drenethi Empire's offer of full cooperation in the investigation of the attack on the civilian vessel Allgate Bridge. We accept this offer and will send a legal and investigative team to coordinate with the proposed tribunal." She paused. "Task Force Allgate will remain at the Calyx outer boundary as neutral observers during the ceasefire implementation period. We are here in support of peace. We are here in memory of 6 people who should not have died in this system. And we are here to ensure that what happened to the Allgate Bridge is recorded, investigated, and never forgotten." She clicked off the broadcast. The bridge was quiet. "Do you think they understand?" Takahashi asked. "Not meaning the Drenethi. Meaning all of them. The Galactic Council, the 700 species in that grand rotating ring, every civilization that had watched humanity's quiet fleet move through the dark and tried to calculate what it meant. They're starting to," she said. She looked out at the amber debris field again. At the old, scattered ice of a system that had nearly burned. "Pass the word to all ships. We hold position. No aggressive maneuvers, no weapon locks, no provocative communications. We are observers. We are witnesses." She touched the pocket of her uniform, feeling the folded paper within. "And we are here." Later, alone in her quarters, Osei made her final coffee of the day. She took out the paper. She read the names one more time. And for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not read them as a promise. She read them as a record. An entry in the long, difficult, ongoing human project of trying to build a galaxy where 6 people on a humanitarian mission could cross a war zone without being destroyed by a mistake that nobody was ever actually held accountable for. She hadn't won a war today. She had won something harder. The Calyx Accord held. This was not, historically speaking, guaranteed. Border peace agreements between civilizations with 6,000 years of institutional warfighting culture had a well-documented tendency to develop quiet cracks within the first decade. The Galactic Council's archives were full of accords that had held for a generation and then failed spectacularly because the underlying conditions had never actually changed, only the immediate pressure. But the Calyx Accord held. 30 years later, the Moon in dispute was a jointly administered research station staffed by scientists from both the Drenethi Empire and the Collective of Free Worlds. The gravitational or they'd almost destroyed each other over turned out to be most efficiently extracted by a cooperative method that neither civilization could have developed alone. The war, in retrospect, had cost both sides more in resources and infrastructure than the Moon was worth. A basic mathematical fact that had been obvious to outside observers for 7 years before they'd stopped fighting. The Allgate Bridge Tribunal lasted 4 years. Commander Vreth was convicted of criminal negligence resulting in death, not intentional murder as the full evidence made clear, but negligence so severe and systematic, born of such contempt for civilian vessel registries and humanitarian mission protocols, that the tribunal established a new category in galactic law specifically for his case. The Vreth Standard, it came to be called, the legal framework that established minimum response times for identification verification before engaging any vessel in a combat zone, and the liability cascade that applied if those protocols were not followed. 17 other species adopted versions of it within a decade. It was currently standard military law across 60% of known spacefaring civilizations. In the Galactic Council archives there was a file, publicly accessible, deliberately made so, that cataloged the full story. The dispute. The attack. The deaths. The quiet fleet that had crossed the dark. The desperate plea. The Admiral's answer. Council archivists had tagged it under several categories: conflict resolution, deterrence, accountability. international law development. But there was one category that was listed first, alphabetically, and that junior archivists always found slightly unusual until they understood it: education. Because that, in the end, was what Task Force Allgate had accomplished most completely. Not a war. Not a punitive occupation. Not a demonstration of military superiority that cowed the Drenethi into temporary compliance while seeding the resentment that would grow into the next conflict. A lesson. Absorbed deeply enough to change behavior. Elder Sewell of the Yethran Communion lived to be 412, unremarkable by her species standards, where some achieved 700, and in the last century of her life she gave a lecture series at 7 different institutions across the galaxy. The series was titled, On the Nature of Human Power and What We Keep Getting Wrong About It. The core argument was simple, and she had spent a century distilling it to its essence. Every other spacefaring civilization, Sewell argued, had developed their relationship with power along a spectrum between 2 poles. At one end, civilizations that had power and used it freely, projecting force as the primary language of interspecies relations. At the other end, civilizations that had power and hoarded it, retreating into defensive postures and preferring isolation to engagement. Humanity, she argued, had somehow found a third position that the galaxy's strategic theorists had not previously considered. A civilization that had significant power, that was entirely willing to use it, and that had nevertheless made the consistent institutional choice to use it in service of specific values rather than in service of accumulation or security. Not always. Not perfectly. The human record had darkness in it, as every species record did. But as a trend, as the dominant pattern across 300 years of Terran Confederation foreign relations, there was something that the galaxy kept underestimating because it seemed too idealistic to be real strategy. They kept choosing the option that was harder, slower, and more expensive in the short term because it produced better outcomes in the long term. Not just for humanity. For everyone. Admiral Yara Osei retired 12 years after the Calyx Accord and returned to Earth. She spent 2 decades teaching at the Confederation Naval Academy, where she was notorious for an annual first-week exercise she called the Allgate Problem. Students were given the complete files of the incident, the attack, the casualties, the diplomatic situation, the fleet orders, and asked to write a position paper on what Task Force Allgate should have done differently. Most students in their first attempt went one of 2 directions. Either they argued the fleet should have done nothing, accepted the apology, let diplomacy work its course, or they argued the fleet should have issued explicit ultimatums, demanded the tribunal as a precondition of any ceasefire, used the leverage of the fleet's presence more aggressively. Both arguments, Osei had noted in 30 years of reviewing them, missed the point. The point was not the outcome. The ceasefire, the tribunal, the Vreth standard, these were important, but they were products of something more fundamental. The point was the choice made deliberately to be present without being threatening. To apply pressure without defining it as pressure. To communicate in the language of patient movement through the dark, something that no ultimatum could have conveyed as effectively. We remember. We came. We are here. Not to destroy. Not to conquer. To bear witness. To ensure accountability. To demonstrate, with 14 ships and 1 admiral and the name of a cargo freighter burned into collective galactic memory, that the lives of 6 civilians on a humanitarian mission were worth every bit as much as the lives of 6 admirals, or 6 emperors, or 6 members of any species' most powerful governing body. That was not naivety. That was not idealism. That was the most sophisticated strategic communication in the history of the Calyx region, and it had worked more completely than any war could have. On the 50-year anniversary of the Calyx Accord signing, the jointly administered research station sent a message to Earth. It was signed by 217 scientists, Drenethi, collective members, and 3 other species who had joined the project over the decades. The message said simply, "We remember the Allgate Bridge. We are grateful." Somewhere in a Confederation Naval Academy office, a retired admiral read the message, looked out the window at a blue sky morning, and reached into her desk drawer for a piece of folded paper that had been there for 60 years. She read it one more time. 6 names. She read them not as a promise and not as a record, but as something she hadn't had a word for until that morning, a foundation. Something solid and terrible and irreplaceable, sunk deep into the bedrock of what the galaxy was slowly, painfully, generation by generation, becoming. She folded the paper back carefully and returned it to its drawer. Outside, the morning continued,